So I was in Barnes & Noble today, and I got to the top of the elevator and I looked off to my left. And there, 10 feet by 10 feet, was a section that was marked Teenage Paranormal Romance. I'm going to tell a romance story. There's nothing teenage about it. There may or may not be anything paranormal. This is not usually the kind of story we would open a show like this with, but what the hell? I was driving from Minneapolis to Chicago in one of those days in November, the kind you don't have here in California, the kind of days when as you're going along the snow starts, and it starts off one flake at a time, small and imperceptible, and pretty soon they grow in size and they become like quarters. They begin to splat against the windshield, and the car at 70 miles an hour starts to shudder a little. It doesn't quite have the purchase it should. I looked in the rearview mirror, and behind me there was an 18-wheeler coming up. And if I was doing 70, he was easily doing 75 or more, because he was coming up really fast, and he shot past me. And once he shot past me, the entire windshield was covered with this black, gooey muck. And the windshield wipers went, "Ugh!" And at that very moment, I was thrown out of that time and out of that place into another time and another place. At that moment, I went back a year before. I went back to the last time I had seen Carolyn. My relationship with Carolyn was an odd one. We had this long-distance relationship. She was in Milwaukee, I was in Minneapolis, and then I was in Chicago, and I would only see her once every few months. And we were a year into the relationship before I found out she was married. And we were a year and a day into the relationship before I found out her husband knew and didn't care. Or gave her permission or something. But it began to eat at me. And making love, and her favorite kind of place to make love was in underheated, really cold hotel rooms, when she'd like to sort of press me or her up against the frosted glass. It was uncomfortable. So I resolved to end it. I went and I picked her up at her office, and I drove her to a nice German restaurant, because I knew she liked German restaurants. One of those places down by the breweries. And we got a table, we got settled in, ordered that first course. The borscht came, the beautiful red beet borscht soup. And I was sort of warming up to say, you know, this isn't working. I was warming up to say, this is not going to be able to continue. When she started weeping, I hadn't even said anything yet. She was weeping into her borscht, and uncontrollably, and I had to stop and say, what's the matter? She said, my aunt died. She began to tell me the story of her aunt, her favorite aunt, the aunt who she had learned everything of value from. The aunt had supported her, the aunt who had given her permission. And all I could do was shut up and listen. All I could do was sit there as she wept and talked and hold her hand. And I held her hand all the way through the borscht. And, you know, by the time the spätzle arrived, we had sort of lost interest in eating, and I paid the bill without even touching any of it. We walked out and got into the car, and I simply drove around aimlessly, block after block, around and around, until she was done crying, until she said, take me to my office. So I dropped her off. And never once had I said, it's over. Never once had I said, we're done. I started to drive away. As I was driving away, I turned on the radio. I just needed a little distraction as I was headed for Chicago. And what came on was This American Life with Ira Glass. What came on was the annual poultry show. There was a story about chickens. There was a story about turkeys. I really didn't pay much attention until the story came on about Mitterrand's last meal. Francois Mitterrand, do you remember him? The president of France, 12 years. Mitterrand died of cancer. There was a story about his last meal, about how he wanted to have a special meal. The last thing to pass his lips was going to be particular. He wanted ortolan. Ortolan, it is a small French bird. It is a small songbird. It is forbidden to eat them. It has been forbidden to eat them ever since the revolution. Not the most recent revolution, the revolution. And even these days, when it is eaten illegally, traditionally it is eaten with a napkin over one's head so that one may not be recognized by one's fellow citizens or God. Ortolan. The bird is captured and then is force-fed. It is drowned in liqueur. The feathers are plucked, but that's it. And then the whole bird is put into a pan and baked, served. The guy who was telling the story about Mitterrand's last meal was an American writer. He had done this piece for Esquire. You can look it up. You can find it. He had tried to replicate it. He had to call 100 chefs before he found one who was even willing to produce it. Ira Glass was interviewing him. But before we get to that, let's go back to Mitterrand. So for his last meal, he invited 30 friends. He did not invite his wife, nor his mistress. 30 other people. They sat at one table. Mitterrand sat at a separate table. Actually, was in his bed. He was in his bed, and there was a small table in front of him. And as each course was served, everyone would, start in. There was the soup course, and there was the foie gras, and there were wine with each course, and there were sorbets between each course to cleanse the palate. And people would eat and talk, and occasionally they would talk to him, but mostly he would eat and pass out. And when he came to, they would serve the next course. And they were all working up to it. They were all working up to the moment when the ortolan came. And when it came and it was served, of the 30 guests, most of them did not eat. But Mitterrand did. He put the napkin over his head and he ate, and afterwards he passed out and he never regained consciousness. And when he died 3 days later, at his funeral, his wife was on one side of the casket, his mistress and his daughter by his mistress were on the other side of the casket. French political family values. So Ira Glass says to the writer, "What was it like?" And the writer says, "I'm sitting at a table. There's a white tablecloth. They brought the ortolan, and frankly it was a small brown speck of a bird, very small. I was surprised at how tiny it was. Sitting on a white plate, and then I put the napkin over my head, and all there was this brown speck in this white world. And in order to have the meal, the chef said that I could not eat the head. And so I started by biting it off and spitting it back onto the plate. I put the rest of the bird in my mouth. Flesh, so succulent, so moist. And then there was the liquor from the inside of the bird scalded my throat, and as I swallowed, I could feel it burn all the way down. And after that, there were the entrails, and I began to chew, and it got bitter. And I thought, can I do this? But I kept chewing, and finally there was nothing but bones, and I really wanted to spit them out. But I had come this far. And so I chewed. And I swallowed. And Ira says, and what was it like? And the writer said, all I can tell you is that if human beings ate every meal with that much concentration on what we were eating and what was happening, we would starve to death. I'm driving along. I'm on the freeway, and I'm listening to this. And this little phrase comes to mind. This little phrase is a variation on Little Red Riding Hood. Oh, wolf, let me eat you. Really? Nuzzle for nuzzle, sniff for sniff, lick for lick, taste for taste, bite for bite, through the flesh, through the bone. Oh, yes, wolf, I am very hungry. And when that thought comes to me, I roll the window down, and coming off of the lake, I can smell the cold water of autumn. I can smell the rain, because it has started to rain. I can smell the oil on the concrete and old rubber. I can smell dead fish. The world is alive with the smells of that which is living and that which is dead. And I can hear the sound of the rain on the windshield wipers. And all of a sudden, alongside of me is an 18-wheeler, and it comes roaring past. And as it roars past, the windshield is sprayed with dark gray water. And I'm reverberating back and forth in time and space. And yet, I'm thinking to myself, how far will we go for desire? Sniff for sniff. Nuzzle for nuzzle. Lick for lick. Bite for bite. How far will we go to have that which we cannot have and must have? Down to the flesh, down to the bone. For we are very hungry.